She only asked for a little milk for her baby brother. 48 hours later, her family had a job, a home, and a second chance. All because of a billionaire no one thought was capable of something like this. The fluorescent lights of the supermarket flickered slightly overhead, casting a sterile white glow over the linoleum floors and endless rows of food stacked with neat precision. To most, it was just another grocery store on just another cold afternoon. But for 8-year-old Lily Rose, this place was both overwhelming and a little bit magical, a place where food lived behind glass and price tags decided everything. She stood near the refrigerated section, her bare feet pressing against the cold floor through worn, too thin shoes. Her blue cotton dress, a size too small and fraying at the seams, fluttered slightly as the automatic cooling system released another gust of chilly air. In one hand, she clutched a bottle of water. In the other, a single coin, enough for almost nothing. Her pale blonde hair was tied in two uneven braids, and her wide blue eyes scanned the milk shelf as though hoping something might suddenly drop into reach. In the old stroller beside her, her baby brother Mikey stirred, his tiny hands twitching. He let out a soft, dry whimper. He hadn't eaten since early morning. A little formula, diluted too much to last. Jessica, their mother, had said they'd try again later. Maybe the store would have a special. Maybe they could make something stretch. Lily didn't understand the full mechanics of hunger, only that when Mikey cried like that, it meant his tummy hurt. And she knew that the kind of formula he needed, the special kind, for babies who got sick easily, cost more than her mama made in an entire shift cleaning houses. Milk would help, her mama had said, even regular milk, if only they could get just one carton. She looked around. No one seemed to notice her. People walked by, holding baskets filled with things she hadn't seen in weeks. Cereal, fruit, crackers, cookies. Their coats were thick, boots dry. They weren't like her. And then she saw him. He was standing a few feet away, right in front of the milk section. A tall man, strong-looking like someone out of a grown-up movie. His shirt was light-colored and pressed without a wrinkle. His trousers were dark blue, clean, expensive. His hair was the color of warm chestnut, combed neatly back. He was studying two different brands of organic milk like they were puzzle pieces. There was something about him. Calm, composed, quiet, but not cold. Not like some of the other adults who rushed past her like she was invisible. She took a step forward, then another. She didn't even think about it. Something inside her just said, go. With one hand still holding the coin, she tugged gently at the man's sleeve. He looked down, eyebrows raised in surprise. She tilted her chin up and asked softly, Mister, do you have any spare milk for my baby brother? The words were simple. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She just asked, with the kind of clarity only a child has when life is reduced to its most urgent needs. The man blinked, unsure if he'd heard her right. His expression shifted, from confusion to something deeper. He crouched down so they were eye level, his brown eyes searching hers. What's your name? He asked gently. Lily. And your brother? Mikey. He's 6 months. He hasn't had anything today. Mama says maybe water would help, but... She trailed off and looked down at the coin in her hand. I thought maybe you had extra. Behind them, a security guard began to approach, concern written all over his face. Children asking customers for food. It wasn't allowed. It made people uncomfortable. He reached for his radio. But the man, Matt Harrison, though Lily didn't know that yet, raised a hand without looking back. The guard stopped. Matt looked at the girl in front of him. Her cheeks were flushed from cold, her fingernails chipped. But her eyes were steady. She wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't even embarrassed. She was just tired. Far too tired for someone her age. He slowly stood up, reached into the cooler behind him, and pulled out a carton of milk. The good kind. He handed it to her. Here, he said. It's yours. Lily blinked. Really? Really? She smiled, just slightly, and whispered, Thank you, before turning back toward the stroller and gently placing the milk next to Mikey's feet. That moment might have ended there. Just a small act of kindness between a stranger and a little girl. But Matt didn't walk away. He watched her. How carefully she moved, how she checked the baby's blanket, how she looked over her shoulder as if to make sure her mother wasn't too far. And in that small gesture, that tiny voice asking for milk, Something inside him shifted, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He didn't know it yet, but that question, "Do you have any spare milk?" would change everything. Jessica Rose rushed past the cereal aisle, her hands gripping the rusted stroller handle, her breath catching slightly from the run. Her eyes darted frantically around the store until she spotted her daughter, small, motionless, and impossibly brave, standing just a few feet away from a man Jessica instantly recognized, though she couldn't quite believe it. Lily was talking to him. Not just anyone. Him. Jessica's pulse quickened. She didn't know his name off the top of her head. Not really. But his face had been in enough business magazines and TV interviews for her to remember. The CEO. The billionaire. The man behind the Harrison Foods empire. The one whose signature was probably on the lease agreement of the very building they were standing in. And her daughter had just asked him for milk. She almost couldn't breathe from the embarrassment. A sick, hot flush spread through her as she rushed forward, grabbing Lily's shoulder a little too firmly. "Lily," she whispered urgently, "what are you doing? You don't go up to strangers and—" Her voice faltered when the man straightened to his full height and turned to face her. There was no anger in his expression, no annoyance, just calm curiosity and something else. Something quiet in his eyes. Compassion? Jessica couldn't make sense of it. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, her voice clipped, trying to pull Lily behind her. "She didn't mean to bother you. We're fine, really." "She didn't bother me," the man replied gently. His voice was even, his gaze steady. "She was very polite." Jessica stiffened. Her cheeks burned. She hated being seen like this. The old track suit she'd thrown on because it was the warmest thing she owned, her hair tied up in a messy knot, her sneakers barely holding together. She looked exactly like someone who couldn't afford a gallon of milk, and now the richest man in the store knew it. "I appreciate your kindness," she said, forcing a tight smile, "but we don't accept charity. We're just figuring things out." Matt studied her, not with judgment, but with a kind of genuine interest that unsettled her. Most people with power and wealth looked right past her. He didn't. He glanced at the stroller. Mikey was curled up under a frayed blanket, a red flush rising in his tiny cheeks from hunger or cold, or both. "Is he sick?" Matt asked quietly. Jessica hesitated. "He's underweight, sensitive digestion. We're waiting on a new pediatric referral." She didn't mention the hospital they had been turned away from twice because of lack of insurance, or the social worker who kept pushing their case further down the list. Matt didn't press. He nodded slowly, as if tucking the information away. Then he turned and signaled to the nearby clerk. "Could you help this lady at the register?" he asked. "Anything she and her kids need. Put it on my account." Jessica's eyes widened. "Number, that's not necessary. It's already done," he said simply. There was no arrogance in his voice, no sense of superiority, just finality. It wasn't a performance. He wasn't looking for recognition. If anything, he already seemed half-turned to leave. Jessica stood frozen for a moment, unsure how to respond. Every instinct inside her told her to reject the offer, to hold on to her pride. But then Mikey whimpered again, and Lily looked up at her with hopeful eyes. She exhaled. "Just the milk," she said softly. "That's all we need." Matt nodded once and said nothing more. He walked past them, out of the aisle, his polished shoes silent on the tile floor. As he passed the security guard, still standing where he had paused moments earlier, the guard gave him a confused look. "Sir, was everything all right?" Matt didn't break stride. "Everything's fine," he replied. "She just asked the right question." He stepped out of the store into the cold late afternoon air, hands in his pockets, heart heavier than it had been in a long time. He'd come here for something simple, a few groceries, maybe a bottle of wine. What he got instead was a glimpse into a world he hadn't allowed himself to see in years. Not since before his success, not since before he'd stopped believing in human connection, in raw need, in unscripted honesty. He thought of Lily's voice, soft, almost apologetic. "Do you have any spare milk for my baby brother?" There was nothing manipulative about it. It wasn't staged. It was the purest form of asking. And it had pierced right through the armor he'd worn for years. Back inside the store, Jessica moved quickly, eyes still wide with disbelief. The clerk rang up the milk. a larger bottle than she would have dared buy, and handed it to her with a polite nod. Jessica muttered her thanks, still unable to process what had just happened. Lily beamed. Back at the motel, that milk would go into Mikey's bottle. He would drink. He would sleep. Jessica didn't know it yet, but that evening would be the first domino to fall. Because Matt Harrison didn't forget people. Not when something inside him was shaken. And this wasn't over. Not even close. The wind outside the glass skyscraper howled low and steady, swirling around the edges of Matt Harrison's 42nd floor office like a distant memory trying to get in. Inside, everything was still. Sleek marble floors, perfectly arranged bookshelves, a minimalist desk without a single item out of place. The world he had built was one of order, precision, distance, and yet something felt off today. The space that once felt powerful now felt hollow. He stood near the floor-to-ceiling window, coffee in hand, but not drinking. His gaze wasn't on the skyline or the blinking lights of the city below. His eyes were unfocused, far away, still lingering somewhere between a worn-out grocery store and the eyes of a little girl who'd asked him, with absolute honesty, for milk. It had been almost 24 hours since that moment, but it hadn't left him. Not when he tried to sleep, not during his morning meetings, not even during his lunch with the board of directors where they pitched a merger worth $500 million. His mind kept circling back to that voice, that question, that baby in the stroller. He hadn't planned to go to that store. It wasn't even the one he normally visited. He was in the area for a meeting that had been rescheduled at the last minute. And truthfully, he'd stopped in more out of habit than necessity. A bottle of sparkling water, a prepared salad, that's all he wanted. He never expected to meet a child who would cut through every wall he'd built around himself with a single sentence. She didn't know who he was. She didn't ask for money. She didn't perform or plead or flatter. She just stood there, her fingers wrapped around a coin too small to matter, and asked for milk for her baby brother. It wasn't the first time Matt had seen poverty. He donated to shelters. He sat on the board of 3 nonprofits. He wrote checks, big ones. But those actions were always clean, structured, filtered through forms and fundraisers. They never looked him in the eye. Lily did. He couldn't stop thinking about how her dress had been torn at the shoulder, how her shoes looked too thin for winter, how her mother's eyes, tired and fierce, had locked with his in that instant of pure, quiet resistance. Jessica Rose hadn't wanted pity. She had almost physically recoiled from his offer, her pride barely allowing her to accept what she knew her child needed. He understood that feeling too well, because once, a long time ago, he had been a child standing in a hallway with his own mother, watching her beg a landlord for one more week. That was before the company, before the tech breakthroughs, before his face meant anything to anyone. He turned away from the window and sat heavily in his chair, pressing his fingers to his temples. Why was this bothering him so much? He'd helped them, hadn't he? Gave the kids some milk, told the clerk to cover whatever they needed. That was more than most people would do. But something inside him knew it wasn't enough. For the first time in years, he felt something that wasn't calculated or scheduled. He felt pulled, drawn, not by obligation or image, but by a genuine, unrelenting ache to do something that mattered. Not because he was a CEO, not because he was rich, because he was human. He opened his laptop and typed quickly into the company database, pulling up the nearest store's transaction history. He had the store number, the time. It wasn't hard to trace. The milk, the bottle of water. He cross-referenced security footage, something he technically wasn't supposed to do himself, but no one dared question his access. There she was, Lily holding the milk, her hands too small for the carton, her face glowing like she'd been handed the moon. Then came her mother, pushing the stroller, arguing, defending, leaving. He hit pause on the frame, freezing Jessica's face mid-step. She looked strong, like someone who'd been forced to hold the world up with one hand while cradling her child with the other. He leaned back, exhaling deeply. He didn't want to patronize them. He didn't want to swoop in and fix them, as if they were broken. They weren't, but they were struggling, and something told him they wouldn't be the only ones. An idea began to form. Not a donation, not a PR stunt. Something real. He picked up his phone and called his assistant. "Janine," he said, I want a list of families who've applied for emergency support through our stores in the last 6 months. Quiet cases, people who were turned away for missing paperwork, expired IDs, too many dependents. There was a pause on the other end. Uh, all of them? All of them, he repeated. And tell legal to stop bearing that food security proposal. I want it restructured. And I want someone who actually knows how it feels to be hungry leading the project. You're serious, she said. I am. After he hung up, he sat in silence again. He didn't know what he was becoming, what this moment meant in the larger arc of his carefully controlled life. But he did know one thing. He couldn't unsee that girl. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't want to. The motel hallway smelled of damp carpet and old paint, and Jessica moved quickly, guiding the squeaky stroller toward room 12B. Her fingers were numb from the cold, and she still hadn't fully processed what had happened in the store earlier that day. The groceries were heavier than usual, though there weren't many, just enough to carry in one trip. Enough to make Lily smile. Enough to make Mikey sleep with a full belly. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was small but neat. A twin bed, a pull-out cot, a chipped dresser, and a single nightstand with a flickering lamp. They'd been staying there for 2 months now, longer than she intended. She paid by the week, in cash, doing odd jobs where she could. Laundry, deliveries, cleaning, whatever was available. Lily rushed inside, peeling off her too-thin coat and heading straight for Mikey's tiny playpen. He was fussing again, but the formula Jessica had picked up, the good formula, was already warming in a small bottle. For once, the timing was perfect. Jessica unpacked the groceries methodically, placing the milk in the mini fridge, setting the diapers under the sink, and finally pulling out something she hadn't bought in weeks, a single orange. A treat for Lily, whose face lit up at the sight of it. "Can we share it now?" she asked, wide-eyed. Jessica nodded, sitting on the edge of the bed. She peeled the orange slowly, handing her daughter slice after slice. They ate together in silence, the way people do when peace feels too rare to interrupt with words. That night, after both children had fallen asleep, Mikey nestled against a warm blanket. Lily curled beside him on the cot. Jessica sat alone near the window. She couldn't sleep. The wind rattled the glass softly, and in the dim light, her thoughts kept circling. She wasn't used to help, not real help, not from strangers, especially not men in pressed shirts who could buy the entire store if they wanted to. And yet there was something different about the man from the grocery store. He hadn't looked down on her. He hadn't smiled in pity or spoken in that voice. The one people used when they were trying to be generous without being kind. No, he had spoken to her like she mattered, like Lily mattered, like her request for milk was not a burden, but a moment worth listening to. Jessica didn't know how to feel about that. The next morning came earlier than she hoped. Mikey's soft cries woke her around 6 a.m., and by 7 she had both kids bundled and fed. Her plan was to walk to the community center and check the bulletin board. Sometimes people posted cleaning jobs or weekend work there. She opened the door and stopped. 2 large cardboard boxes sat at her feet. There was no knock, no note, just the boxes. Jessica looked down in disbelief. Inside one, cans of baby formula, the exact kind Mikey needed, a stack of diapers, baby wipes, a warm blanket. In the second, fresh fruit, cereal, milk, bread, even a small jar of coffee. Lily poked her head around the door. "Did Santa come early?" she asked. Jessica gave a dry laugh, shaking her head. "I think it was someone else." They brought the boxes inside. Jessica checked the hallway, but no one was there. The motel receptionist had no idea where they'd come from. It wasn't a charity drop-off. No name, no logo, just help. Quiet help. That evening, it happened again. Another box, this time with a new pack of bottles, baby lotion, and a pair of brand new pajamas for Mikey. A note was included, but only 4 handwritten words. "You are not alone." Jessica sat down on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling slightly as she read the message again. It wasn't signed. The handwriting was plain, but the message, it struck something inside her that had been locked away for months, maybe years. She'd spent so long being strong, so long carrying the weight of 2 children and no safety net, that she'd nearly forgotten what it felt like to be seen. Not judged, not pitied, Seen. She pressed the note to her chest and closed her eyes, letting herself feel the weight of the moment. The tears came slowly, not desperate, not broken, just real. Relief, gratitude, disbelief. She cried quietly, careful not to wake the kids. That night, she didn't sleep near the window. She climbed into bed beside Lily and Mikey, wrapped one arm around each of them, and let herself breathe. Meanwhile, blocks away, in a high-rise apartment lined with clean angles and soft lighting, Matt Harrison stood in his kitchen staring at his phone. On the screen was a photo, a blurry snapshot from a security camera near the motel entrance, showing someone delivering the boxes. Not him, of course. He didn't go himself, but he made sure they arrived. He had instructed his team to do it quietly. No logos, no branding, no strings. Just what she needed, when she needed it. He didn't want her to know it came from him. Not yet. It wasn't about being the hero. It was about listening. He set the phone down, walked to the window, and looked out at the city below. Somewhere out there was a woman who had fought every day to keep her children alive, and a little girl who had asked for milk like it was a miracle. He hadn't expected to care this much, but he did, and something told him. This was just the beginning. The weather had turned colder by the end of the week. Winds swept through the city in sudden, sharp bursts, carrying the scent of oncoming snow. Jessica clutched Mikey closer to her chest in the carrier, wrapping his tiny body tightly in a secondhand fleece blanket. Her other hand held Lily's firmly as they made their way toward the community center. Not for work this time, but because Lily's school was hosting a weekend event there. Crafts, music, free hot cocoa, something cheerful, something to forget, even for a couple of hours, that they were still living in a motel room with a flickering heater and only one working light bulb. Jessica didn't know it yet, but someone was already watching her. Not in the way that made her nervous. She'd had enough of that, but in the quiet, deliberate way of someone who had been paying attention. Across the city at Harrison Foods headquarters, Matt Harrison sat in a private conference room, reviewing the initial draft of a new internal policy memo. It had been his own idea, a quiet aid program to identify and support families like Jessica's, especially those who slipped through traditional systems. No applications, no waiting lists, no shame, just targeted, private help through local stores, based on in-person reports and discreet employee observations. But the paperwork on his desk didn't hold his focus. Instead, he stared at the computer monitor where a paused video clip rested, muted footage from a store camera. It showed Jessica gently adjusting Mikey's blanket while Lily reached for a free sample cookie at the community center. Just a quiet moment, unnoticed by the world, but it stopped him. There was something about the way Jessica moved, the way she crouched beside her daughter and smiled, even though her eyes looked so tired. The way she gently patted Mikey's back without even thinking about it, like a reflex she'd grown into out of necessity. Matt hadn't said a word to her since the day in the store. He hadn't approached her or reached out, but something inside him kept circling back to that interaction. That look she gave him when she told him she wasn't a beggar. That pride, that resistance. He respected it more than he could explain. His assistant, Janine, stepped into the room. "She's applied," she said quietly, holding out a small folder. Matt looked up. "Who?" "Jessica Rose. You asked me to flag any job applications under her name. This came in through the janitorial services portal yesterday." She hesitated, reading his expression. "It's for a part-time cleaning position at the downtown admin branch." He took the folder, opened it. The resume was brief, gaps in employment, a few scattered references. A line at the bottom that read, "Former junior Olympic track hopeful. Career ended due to injury." He stared at those words longer than he expected. "She's overqualified for janitorial work," he said. "Yes," Janine agreed, "but I don't think she's in a position to argue." Matt closed the folder, slowly, thoughtfully. "Set up the interview," he said. "Make sure it's in the building. Put her on the books as community outreach applicant. Don't mention me." Janine nodded and turned to leave. Before she reached the door, Matt added, "And if she accepts, move her to payroll. Full health coverage. Daycare assistance." Janine paused, glanced back at him, then smiled faintly. "You've got a soft spot." "No," Matt replied. "I've got a memory." That same day, Jessica received the email, a job interview. Not a cleaning gig at the store level, but at the main office. She blinked at the message in disbelief, rereading it 5 times. It didn't seem real. She hadn't applied for that job. Someone must have forwarded her information. Or there'd been a mistake. She didn't care. She borrowed a blazer from another woman at the motel. Someone 2 sizes bigger, but it worked. She pulled her hair back, put on a little mascara, and gave herself a long look in the mirror. There were lines under her eyes. Her cheekbones were sharper than they used to be. But she looked like someone who hadn't given up. Lily gave her a thumbs up before she left. Mikey was napping. For the first time in a long time, Jessica walked out the door with hope in her chest instead of fear. The building was huge. Glass, steel, polished to perfection. She almost turned around twice, but she didn't. The woman who met her in the lobby, Claire from HR, had kind eyes and offered her tea. They sat in a small conference room where Jessica expected a stack of forms and a long explanation about underqualification. Instead, Claire leaned forward and said, "This position is part of a new program, community-grounded hiring. We want people who know what life is like outside of boardrooms, people who understand struggle, who can build bridges. I think you're perfect for it." Jessica didn't know how to respond. Her throat tightened. "You'll start part-time," Claire continued. "Administrative support, flexible hours. There's also an in-building daycare for infants, and a transport stipend." Jessica blinked. "This can't be real." Claire smiled. "It is." When she walked out of the building an hour later, her hands trembled around the paper folder containing the offer. The city looked brighter. The wind wasn't as harsh. She pulled her coat tighter and whispered, "Thank you," though she wasn't sure who she was saying it to. What she didn't know, what no one told her, was that someone had been watching through a glass wall above the lobby, out of sight. Someone in a light shirt and dark blue slacks, standing very still, watching her walk away, and smiling. Just a little. For the first time in years, Matt Harrison didn't feel like a stranger in his own empire. He felt connected. Because helping someone quietly, not for headlines, not for credit, but just because you can, sometimes changes more than a life. Sometimes it changes you. Monday morning came quietly, with a kind of pale, muted sunrise that looked like the sky hadn't slept much either. Jessica stood in the motel bathroom, staring at herself in the mirror, trying to find the woman who had once been fearless. She adjusted the collar of the donated blazer and smoothed her pants, the ones she'd hand-washed the night before in the motel sink. Her fingers trembled slightly, though not from cold. This time, it was nerves. Mikey slept peacefully in his new carrier, donated just days ago by someone she still didn't know. The mystery boxes had stopped arriving as suddenly as they'd begun, not out of cruelty, but like a hand that lets go once it knows you're standing on your own. The last one had contained a soft toy for Mikey and a note. "You've got this." Jessica believed it now, or at least she wanted to. She walked into the sleek glass building of Harrison Foods with her head held high, trying not to be overwhelmed by the scale of it. Clean lines, polished stone, and a kind of engineered calmness filled the lobby. It smelled of paper and fresh espresso. She checked in with the front desk, then followed the directions to a small office on the 3rd floor, marked Community Initiatives, Special Projects. Inside, Claire, the same kind woman from her interview, greeted her with a warm smile and a genuine hug. "I'm so glad you're here," Claire said, handing her a badge. "We're going to get you settled in today. You'll be helping us organize outreach programs, schedule aid deliveries, manage family case logs. You know, all the stuff we used to fumble through without someone who actually understood the people we're helping." Jessica didn't know whether to laugh or cry. For once, she didn't feel like a shadow walking among people who had everything figured out. She felt useful. By noon, she had her own desk, a second-hand laptop, a notepad, a printed schedule. It wasn't much, but to her, it was a palace. Meanwhile, across the building, Matt Harrison was pretending to focus on a finance presentation, but his eyes kept drifting toward the glass wall of the conference room. He didn't know if Jessica had started yet. He'd told himself to stay back, to let her settle in without interference. But it gnawed at him, the urge to see for himself that she was okay. He excused himself quietly and walked through a back corridor, his steps slower than usual. He passed the break room, then paused just outside the special projects office. Through the narrow window in the door, he saw her. She was leaning over her desk, reviewing a form with Claire. Her hair was pulled back, her focus sharp. Her blazer, still a little too big, sat stiffly on her shoulders, but she wore it like armor. She looked tired and strong and real. He didn't go in. But that evening, fate made the choice for him. It was nearly 6 o'clock when Jessica stepped outside the building for some air. Mikey had been in the on-site daycare for the first time, and she missed him more than she expected. She stood just near the corner of the building, looking out over the city, rubbing her hands together in the cold. Then she heard a voice behind her. "Long day?" She turned quickly, startled. There he was. In person, no security, no barrier of screens or assistants. Matt Harrison, the man who had given her milk without asking anything in return. The man who had changed her life and somehow never taken credit. She stiffened, unsure how to respond. "Wasn't expecting to see you," she said cautiously. "Same," he replied, stuffing his hands into his coat pockets. "I was walking, thinking." They stood there for a moment in silence, as the sounds of the city curled around them. Traffic in the distance, a siren echoing blocks away, the rustle of leaves scraping across pavement. "You knew, didn't you?" she asked finally. "About the boxes, the job, all of it." He nodded slowly. "I did." "Why?" He met her eyes, and for the first time, there was no CEO in his gaze. Just a man, tired, human, caring more than he showed. "Because you asked for milk," he said. "Not for yourself, for your child. And you did it with more grace than most people show when they're asking for millions." She folded her arms, partly for warmth, partly out of reflex. "I didn't want a handout." "I know," he said. "That's not what I saw." She looked away, eyes glassy but dry. "I didn't want to be saved." "You weren't," he said gently. "You stood up on your own. I just gave you a place to stand." Jessica let the words settle. They were uncomfortable, vulnerable. "True. I didn't think people like you paid attention to people like me," she admitted. "You live so high above all this." "I did," he said, "but I missed a lot up there." Another silence. But it wasn't awkward now. It was full. "Why now?" she asked quietly. "Why me?" Matt hesitated, then looked out at the sky. "Because once, a long time ago, I had a mom like you. She didn't ask for help either. She just survived. And I never forgot how hard that looked, even when I was too young to name it. You reminded me." Jessica felt her breath catch. No speech could have hit harder than that. "Thank you," she said. "Not just for the job, not just for the help, for seeing her." He didn't nod. He didn't smile. He just said, "You deserved it." As the cold deepened, they both knew it was time to go. He turned to leave, then stopped. "If you ever need anything," he began. She cut him off with a wry smile. "I'll ask." And this time he smiled too. A small, honest, tired smile. The kind you give only when you mean it. They went their separate ways that night, but something had shifted. He wasn't a stranger anymore, and she wasn't alone. The days passed like pages slowly turning, in a book Jessica never thought she'd be allowed to write. The kind of life she had once dreamed of from the other side of a window. Each morning she dressed Mikey, kissed Lily's forehead, and walked through the tall glass doors of Harrison Foods with a name badge, a purpose, and something she hadn't felt in years: security. Her work at the Community Initiatives Department quickly grew beyond spreadsheets and case folders. She became a voice, a translator between two worlds. For the first time, people in suits were listening to someone who had once been on food stamps. She proposed small changes that made a big difference. Flexible pickup hours for struggling parents. Anonymous delivery options for those too ashamed to be seen accepting help. Direct resource channels from store managers to her team. No paperwork needed. Matt watched it all happen from a respectful distance, but not entirely from the shadows. Their encounters grew more frequent, not in boardrooms or scheduled meetings, but in passing, in the elevator, or late in the office kitchen when both of them were too tired to pretend they weren't still at work. It was in those quiet moments that their connection began to shift. One evening, after a long planning session for an upcoming winter aid drive, Jessica lingered behind while the others packed up. Her hands sifted absently through a box of donated coats, checking sizes, sorting by warmth. She didn't notice Matt standing in the doorway until he cleared his throat. You're not going to rest until every child in the city is warm, are you? He said with a half smile. She looked up and smirked. You say that like it's a bad thing. It's not, he replied, stepping inside. It's kind of extraordinary. Jessica rolled her eyes playfully. Don't flatter me. You're the one who signs the checks. He shook his head and picked up a coat from the box. Money is easy. Belief isn't. She paused, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. It wasn't the first time he'd let the mask slip, but this time felt different, closer. I used to think people with money didn't believe in anything but themselves, she said honestly. Matt didn't flinch. A lot don't. I didn't, for a long time. He sat on the edge of a nearby table watching her carefully. Then you walked up to me in that store, or rather Lily did. Jessica smiled at the mention of her daughter, but didn't respond. She simply kept folding the sleeves of a child's parka, smoothing the fabric between her fingers. Can I ask you something? Matt said after a moment. She nodded. Was there ever a moment when you felt like it wasn't worth it? Like giving up might have been easier? Jessica didn't answer right away. She placed the coat into a pile, leaned against the box, and looked down at her hands. Yeah, she said quietly. There was a night after Mikey was born when I realized I couldn't afford diapers. I was sitting on the floor, holding him, just crying. Lily was asleep. I didn't want her to hear, and I remember thinking, this can't be what my life is now. Matt didn't move. He didn't interrupt. But then Mikey made this little sound, like a laugh, just this tiny hiccuping laugh in his sleep, and it broke me. I knew I didn't have the right to give up. Not when they were still fighting just to breathe. Her voice was calm, not emotional, not seeking sympathy. It was the kind of honesty that lived past shame. Matt stood slowly and crossed the room, stopping a few feet from her. You're stronger than anyone I know, he said. You've lived 1,000 lives before you were 30. Jessica looked up at him. This man who used to seem so unreachable. Now he looked just as tired, just as hopeful, just as human as she felt. It's not strength, she said. It's love. They stood in silence, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly above them. Somewhere in the distance, a vacuum hummed as a janitor cleaned the floor. Then Matt said something that surprised them both. Come to dinner with me. Jessica blinked. What? I mean, not like a work dinner. Not business. Just a quiet place. Good food. No agenda. She hesitated, unsure whether to laugh or say yes. Lily can come, he added quickly. And Mikey, it's not a date unless you want it to be. Just a thank you, maybe, or a beginning. Jessica smiled. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. Let me ask my babysitter, she said playfully. He grinned. I hear she's tough. The moment passed, but something between them had shifted. Again. What had started as charity, then turned into trust, was beginning to stretch towards something softer, warmer. Not dependence, not obligation. Something like care. That night, when Jessica returned to the motel, Lily rushed to the door with a crayon drawing in hand. A picture of them in a house, with a real roof and a tree, and sunlight that looked like it lasted forever. Mikey gurgled in his sleep, and Jessica kissed his forehead, letting the weight of the day finally settle. She didn't know what was coming next, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of it. The snow came early that year. By the time December rolled in, the city was already blanketed in a quiet, shimmering white that softened even the hardest edges of the streets. Rooftops glistened, car horns were muffled, and the corners of windows sparkled like something out of a storybook. For most people, the cold was an inconvenience, another layer of traffic and ice. But for Jessica, it was a reminder of how far they'd come. Only months ago, she'd watched frost creep across the thin windows of their motel room, wondering how she'd keep her children warm. Now, standing at the window of a modest two-bedroom apartment, not fancy, but theirs, she smiled as she watched Lily press her nose to the glass, tracing little hearts in the condensation. "Mommy, look!" Lily squealed. "It's snowing on the whole world," Jessica laughed softly. "Not the whole world, baby, just ours." The apartment was quiet and warm. Mikey lay on the floor, gurgling happily as he kicked his feet inside a new set of footy pajamas. Boxes still lined the hallway. They had only moved in 2 weeks ago, but Jessica didn't mind the clutter. It was a mess made of life, not survival. There were dishes in the sink and laundry to do, and crayon marks already on the wall. But she no longer had to look at her children and wonder how they'd eat tomorrow. Lily's voice cut through the air again, more serious this time. "Do you think he'll come?" Jessica turned from the sink. "Who?" "Mr. Matt," Lily said, as if it were obvious. "He said he'd be at the school concert. He promised." Jessica smiled faintly. "I think if he promised, then he will." Lily grinned, then ran to the bedroom to put on her performance dress. The pale blue one they'd bought secondhand and fixed together, with stitched-on stars and a ribbon sash. She would be singing in her class's winter concert that night. It was the first time she'd ever stood on a real stage. Jessica was nervous, not because of the concert, but because of what it all meant. Matt had become something more than just the man who helped them. Over the weeks, they'd shared dinners, some quiet, some filled with laughter. He had held Mikey with gentle, practiced hands. He had knelt on the floor beside Lily as she showed him her drawings. And when they talked about life, about failure, about the quiet courage it took to simply keep going, he listened. She hadn't expected to feel anything for him beyond gratitude, but something had grown there, slowly, carefully. It wasn't a fairy tale romance, sweeping or loud. It was something deeper, the quiet recognition between two people who had lived through brokenness and still chose hope. Later that evening, the school auditorium buzzed with excitement. Parents squeezed into rows of metal chairs, coats draped over their laps, phones ready to record every shaky note and dance step. The backdrop was made of cardboard snowflakes in blue velvet. The children filed onto the stage one by one, like tiny stars blinking into place. Jessica sat near the front, Mikey on her lap, bundled in a knit blanket. She looked over her shoulder every few seconds, her heart thudding. The concert had already begun. Then she saw him. Matt slipped in quietly through the side door, snow dusting his shoulders. He wasn't wearing his usual crisp suit. Tonight, he was in a soft sweater and a wool coat, looking almost like every other dad in the room. But when his eyes met Jessica's, there was a stillness in him, a warmth that made her chest tighten. He made his way toward her slowly, careful not to disrupt anything. He sat beside her and nodded toward the stage. "Did I miss her?" he whispered. "Not yet," Jessica replied. "You're just in time." When Lily stepped forward to sing, the room went silent. She stood in her little blue dress, her braids slightly crooked, her cheeks pink with nerves. But when she saw Matt in the audience, her eyes lit up, and her voice rang clear and strong. Jessica watched through tears, clutching Mikey as if anchoring herself in the moment. After the concert, in the chaos of hugs and cocoa and dozens of proud parents snapping photos, Lily ran straight into Matt's arms. "You came," she beamed. "Of course I did," he said, lifting her slightly. "I wouldn't miss it for anything." Jessica stood nearby, unsure what to say. He looked over at her, and the noise of the room seemed to fade. "I want to show you something," he said quietly. "Both of you." They drove in silence. Lily sat in the back, sleepy but still glowing from the night's excitement. Mikey dozed in his carrier. Jessica watched Matt from the passenger seat, wondering what he was planning. They pulled up to a quiet residential street lined with old brick townhouses. Snow clung to the bushes. Lights twinkled on windows. Matt stepped out and walked to the sidewalk, motioning for her to follow. Jessica stepped out, the cold biting her cheeks. Lily clung to her side. Then he turned toward a red brick home with a white door and gently said, "This is yours." Jessica froze. "What are you talking about?" "It's a rental property I bought a few years ago. I've had it vacant for too long. It needs life. It needs people like you." Jessica shook her head. "Matt, I can't." "You can. And you're not taking anything from me. You're giving me something. You're giving me the chance to do something right. You said you didn't want to be saved. I believe you. You already saved yourself. But now, you get to live, not just survive." Jessica's throat tightened. Her eyes burned. "And if it helps," Matt added, stepping closer, "I'd like to be part of that life. Not as a savior, not as some perfect man with a checkbook, just me. A man who was changed by a little girl who asked for milk and a mother who never gave up." Jessica looked at him then. truly looked. And she saw not the billionaire, not the CEO, but a man who had lost, who had grieved, and who had dared to open himself up again. "I don't have all the answers," she whispered. "Neither do I," he said, "but I know what I want." And then, for the first time, she reached for his hand. It was warm, solid, familiar. They stood there in the snow, two people who had built something beautiful out of nothing. Not a fairy tale, but something far better. Something real. Some stories don't need a dramatic rescue or a grand, sweeping romance to leave a mark. Sometimes all it takes is one moment of honesty. A child asking for milk, not out of pity, but love. What makes this story powerful isn't that a billionaire helped a struggling family. It's that he listened, really listened. And in doing so, he let himself be changed. Jessica didn't need to be saved. She needed to be seen. Lily didn't ask for miracles. She believed in one. And Matt Harrison, a man shaped by success and solitude, found his way back to being human through their quiet strength. This isn't a fairy tale. It's not polished or perfect. It's messy, real, and full of the kind of hope that survives in the cracks. The ending isn't about wealth or status. It's about choice. The choice to care, to reach, to stay. And in that, I think, lies the real miracle.